When a game of chess is lost in just a handful of moves, some serious mistake is the culprit. In most cases, the serious mistake is someone unwittingly hanging a piece and giving up in disgust. This will happen a lot, and when you're first learning chess, you'll often be the player who is hanging their pieces. It's normal, and it's instructive, so look at such errors as learning tools that help you avoid tossing pieces away for nothing, and that help you take note when your opponent leaves a piece floating in midair. Again, giving away pieces is the norm in a game between beginners. And learning to avoid that disease and also punish it is the first step to chess competence. In fact, the pain of giving something away will train you to look at every piece and pawn as a cherished possession. Once you have that mindset, you'll automatically make sure all your guys are safe from attack or protected in some manner. Pushing aside the many games that end in an oops moment, there's another way to lose quickly, and that is walking headfirst into some devastating tactic. And it's extremely important because beginners and experienced players fall into that pit all the time. In fact, even grandmasters sometimes find themselves on their knees after just a few moves. We'll be looking at quite a few of these tactical debacles in this lecture. These kinds of games are quick, fun, and usually won by patterns that you already know. The main reason why someone falls on their face quickly is by allowing their king to get in trouble right out of the gate. The fastest mate, called the fool's mate, occurs in just 2 moves, with black lowering the boom. It's actually used a lot in movies and TV shows, and I once made it a reporter in this matter during a TV interview. I want you, for a moment, to stare at this diagonal. Okay, here we go. F4, E6, G4. You notice what's happened. This whole diagonal has been destroyed by the pushing of these 2 pawns, and black plays queen H4 mate. The quickest mate possible in chess, this is called the fool's mate. Once you know this theme, you'll be far more careful with your king, and you'll be able to use other iterations of the same pattern. Here's a game I played in a simultaneous exhibition against 72 opponents. And the same game, or something similar, has been seen countless times over the last 150 years. F4. This is known as the bird's opening. White intends to fight for the E5 square, with this combined with a knight to F3 move. And perhaps B3 and the bishop would go to B2, everything hitting the E5 square. Black has many ways to reply, but he plays a thing called the Fromm's Gambit. E5, takes it, D6, takes that, and black is able to capture back with the bishop. So black's a pawn down, but he has a big lead in development, and this diagonal is vulnerable. White now plays a major blunder, seen endlessly. Knight C3. Queen H4 check, G3. You give your queen away, why not? He takes it, he has no choice, and the game ends after only 6 moves. The bishop has mated the king. With this mate in mind, let's take a look at the following game, played in 1924. D4, knight F6, knight D2. That's not very logical, since White's queen is no longer protecting D4, and the knight is blocking the C1 bishop. White's most popular move is C4, but no, he went with knight D2. Okay. So black is thinking, this guy is not very good, so let's just try to pummel him. So he goes E5, sacrificing material and trying to mix things up. His opponent took it. He moves the knight so he can regain this pawn. And sure enough, White shows that he's probably a beginner. H3, attacking the knight. The answer? Knight to E3. And once again, we're going to see death by the same diagonal. The knight threatens the queen. The queen has nowhere to go thanks to this dumb knight on d2 and the c-pawn. And so if you don't want to lose your queen to a knight, you have to take it. But the trouble then is that diagonal is compromised. And after queen check, g3, queen takes g3 is mate. We've seen this before. This is Legall's mate, but I want to show it to you again, and then you'll see why in the game that follows. Knight takes e5, the queen is taken, bishop f7 check, king e7, and there's our mate. This mate with the bishop on f7 pushes the enemy king forward, and it takes on many guises. We're going to look at Legall's mate in sheep's clothing. e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6. This is the Petrov defense, has a good reputation. Knight takes e5, but this move doesn't. Usually you can get your pawn back, but in those days, back in 1915, they didn't care about getting a pawn back. They just wanted to kill the opponent, and it was all about quick development. And so black gets his quick development, d takes c6. Now you notice that he's opened up everything. He's a pawn down, but all his pieces, the diagonals are there. The queen has a straight line. Lots of activity. That's all they dreamed of. d3, and he keeps getting his pieces out. White goes bishop g5, and we have black doing the Legalls. Knight takes e4. Of course, if you were to take this bishop would hang right here. It would be undefended. The queen could capture it, and there's other things that happening too. It doesn't matter. He doesn't do that. Instead, of course, he does what everybody would do. He chops the queen, probably thinking that the guy missed it, and now he's going to win the game. But that's not the way it goes. Bishop takes f2 check, king e2, and now we have this offshoot of Legall's mate. You develop your bishop, bishop g4, and it's mate. White simply got blown off the board in 8 moves. Once you look at this Legall theme several times, it will be fairly easy to emulate. But sometimes knowledge of that theme allows you to do something really special, something really, really beautiful. This is one of those cases. Everything starts out innocent, bring your pieces out. Black decides, okay, I'm gonna just go crazy and try to kill this guy, which is typical. d4, white hits right back in the center. So who's boss? It's gonna take a moment to figure that out. Now white does have 3 pieces developed to black's 1, so that's a big advantage. And by taking that pawn, now white has 4 pieces developed to black's 1. And now black starts cowering. So I think he's clearly going to get the bad side of this. White decides, geez, okay, I'm just going to go right for you. And now the knight and the bishop are both hitting f7. And already white has a strong attack. So black brings his knight out, hitting the queen. Bishop f7 check. The king has reached a square that it really never wants to go to. However, something amazing happens now. Very rare. In this position, the queen is attacked by the knight, and so the queen moves, but it doesn't move where he thought it would. The queen launches itself right at the enemy knight and gobbles it. The guy takes with the king. Notice that if he took with the pawn, we would have a Legall's mate, knight to d5 mate. So he avoided that. He took with the king, knight d5 check, king e5, and now we have something really funny. Everything retreats. White retreats his knight, check. Black has to take the pawn. He has nowhere else to go. And then white retreats his other knight, and amazingly, it's mate, right in the middle of the board, crucified. As we've seen, allowing your king to be pushed around is a great way to lose in a fast and painful manner. Another way people lose quickly is by moving too fast, only to discover that the move they made turns out to be a horrific error. One version of the moving too fast paradigm occurs when a player's lizard brain tells him that the guy across from him made an error, and instead of patiently looking at it and trying to figure out what the opponent is thinking, Mr. Lizard instantly pounces on his foe, more or less fueling his decisions on fumes rather than logic. A typical example of this can be found in a well-known line of the Budapest Gambit. We're going to look at a very old trap. D4, knight f6, c4, and black plays the Budapest Gambit, which is actually quite sound. A lot of people like it. Takes, knight g4. So black is just trying to get lots of activity with his pieces. White guards it and develops at the same time. Black develops and attacks the pawn again. White develops and guards the pawn again. There's a certain flow here. Black goes bishop b4 check, and now often the knight goes to c3. In fact, I've played that myself as white, but in this case he goes knight bd2, which is fine. Queen e7. Now black has 1, 2, 3 pieces hitting this pawn, and there's only 2 defenders. But don't forget that black sacrificed a pawn, so if he regains it, it's just equal material. White attacks the bishop. Now black, instead of moving the bishop to safety, takes this pawn. Now normally somebody would look and say, why is he giving me the bishop? But most likely in this situation, white just thought, oh, he didn't notice. You just kind of look at the world through, very personal eyes. And after that, he just totally missed this trap. So what he does is he hangs the bishop, pawn takes bishop, and he misses knight to d3 mate. This is mate because the whole file, this pawn, is pinned by the queen on that e-file. Many, many people have fallen for this trap, and many, many people will fall for it in the future. At this point, you're probably beginning to realize that the tactical themes and patterns you learned in Lecture 4 can appear at any time, and you need to be fully conversant with them if you wish to punish opponents who walk right into one of these traps. And you also need to master them if you intend to avoid being the trapped instead of the trapper. In chess, it just takes a badly timed blink to send your position into a raging inferno. Here's a game between 2 chess experts that only lasted 11 moves. See if you notice which patterns drag black down. And yes, I also did a double take when I saw black's name. E4, E6, French defense again, very popular. D4, D5, threatens the pawn, so white develops, guards his pawn at the same time. Black captures it, and the knight recaptures. So far, this has been seen zillions of times. Black brings his knight to D7, white develops. Both sides are just doing normal stuff. Knight gf6. All the knights have come out. You'd think this is going to be a long, hard, fault-out game, but something happens. He takes and trades, he trades. It's also innocent. Bishop to d3, and black castles. White moves his queen to e2. And this looks like a very innocent move. It eyes the e4 and e5 square. It gets off the first rank. It gives the option to castle queenside. It does everything nice, an innocent move. But the fact is, it's setting up a nasty trap, which is based on our double attack theme. And he walks right into it, b6. Better move, of course, just attack the center with c5. But no, he made this unfortunate error, b6. And bishop takes f6. What this does is he removes the guardian of h7. The guy has to take back. And now we have 2 weaknesses. This rook is undefended. Nothing's guarding it, just hanging in the air. This pawn here, only guarded by the king. And we've already discussed how that can be a very dangerous point. And so white plays queen e4, threatening both queen h7 mate and winning a full rook with queen a8. and Black immediately resigned. Black's mistakes. He failed to notice the double attack. He failed to keep an eye on h7, which we've learned is a common mating square, and he failed to worry about his undefended a8 rook. As you know, allowing your pieces to be undefended is, at best, risky business. Here's another example of a game-ending double attack. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and we get the Ruy Lopez. This opening is named after the 16th century priest Ruy Lopez. What other name would he have? And it's one of the most popular and oldest openings. The world's best players happily take both sides. Knight f6, d3, and now the strange knight e7, which is known as the Mortimer trap. This strange move, which apparently gives away the e5 pawn, was first seen in games by James Mortimer in 1883, and it was really popular at first for about 10 years. And then interest waned and more logical moves took precedence. A lot of people have written that the sole purpose of knight e7 is to trick the opponent into taking that pawn. But that's not really so. By moving the knight back, White's bishop on b5 is suddenly floating in the air and will be kicked around by something like c7 to c6. The knight on e7 can relocate to g6. So, all in all, it's actually something that one can maybe rehabilitate. Anyway, after knight e7, White indeed took the pawn. He fell for the trap, not for the first time, not for the last. I think a lot of people would fall for this trap. And Black played pawn to c6. Believe it or not, White resigned. Why? Why in the world would he resign? Well, here's the problem. Of course, you're about to have your piece taken. If you move it away, let's say to a4, he plays queen a5 check, and suddenly he's attacking your king, he's attacking your bishop, and he's attacking your knight. 3 pieces are being attacked simultaneously. You're going to lose a piece, and you're going to lose the game because you've lost a piece for a pawn. If he decides just to move the bishop to a safe square, he's still going to lose the knight. The knight's attacked, the king's attacked. You're going to lose the knight. However, there's actually something kind of interesting, and he shouldn't have resigned. He should have tried one of his own traps. And it's quite fun. In this position, he should have tried, crossed his fingers, knight c4. Now, what do you think might happen if Black takes this bishop? Yep, knight d6 mate, and suddenly the trapper is trapped. So, after knight c4, you can't take the bishop. So what you're going to do instead is simply protect that square. This square on d6 is really, this knight's about to jump onto the d6 square. You can't allow it. He moves the knight. The bishop now guards the square. There's no more mate. Suddenly this bishop is hanging again. It has to move. And after b5, we now have a fork. This game, which only lasted 5 moves, but still could have had a few exciting moments if White tried knight c3, featured a double attack, a smothered mate, and a pawn fork. This means that all the tactical patterns you've learned can appear at any moment, often with variations that will make use of several other tactical patterns. One must wonder if such basic tactics can be successful at a high level. The answer is yes, since these patterns are the building blocks of all combinations and tactics. Of course, in professional chess, simple forms of these patterns are usually avoided with ease, but once in a while, even a world champion can fall victim to something obvious. Our next game features a straightforward double attack, which brings the 12th world champion to his knees in only 12 moves. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, b6. This is a Queen's Indian and a very professional type opening. Both players are 2 of the better players in the world, and it's quite normal to play these moves. a3, covers the square and doesn't allow the bishop to come here and give check or make any pins. There's many other moves, but that's perfectly legitimate. Bishop a6 hits the pawn, and it's kind of annoying. The queen guards it, but now the d4 square isn't controlled by the queen, and so that gives black certain options. So we're looking at high-stakes strategy here. The bishop moves again, and now it hits the e4 square, trying to lay claim to that. The knight says, no, I'm going to keep that square. And now c5 hitting this other square. White grabs the center. Black takes. Just normal moves. He brings his knight out, he trades, and then he brings his bishop to f4. So far you're thinking everything's fine. How can anybody lose this so fast? Both sides have featured high-level strategic ideas. Now Karpov decides to fight for dark squares on f4 and e5. And so he plays a very good move. Knight h5, hitting the bishop. But the point is to chase the bishop away from the e5 square and then fight for the f4 square. And he does that with bishop d6. Now I have to say that the right move would have been queen b8 when you notice that this queen is hitting the e5 and the f4 square working with the bishop. And that would have given a very interesting game. But Karpov just made a quick move and he thought, well, I'm going to do it with the bishop hitting these two squares, all part of his strategy. But something terrible happened. In this position, white did a retreating move, and retreat moves are actually hard to see. You don't expect the guy to go back to where he came from. White played queen d1, and suddenly, to Karpov's horror, Christensen, of course, was white, who's a very famous American player, considered one of the greatest attacking players in U.S. history. Karpov is considered one of the greatest positional players of all time. And of course, he was world champion for quite a while. But queen d1, it doesn't matter how good you are, suddenly the bishop's hanging and the knight's hanging. And that goes back to our undefended pieces. Both are undefended, and Karpov is going to lose a whole piece. So he just resigned, gave up. He would have no chance in this game, and he lost. 12 moves. Truly a shocking result. Okay, I promised short, brutal games, and this last one wasn't brutal, though I'm sure Karpov would disagree. So let's have some fun with a few more truly brutal takedowns. d4, c5, d5, e6, knight c3, e takes d5, knight takes d5, and now the very strange knight e7, bishop to g5, pinning the knight, h6. Black is a gentleman named Emery Tate, and he's a really gifted tactician who loves to push the envelope against anyone and everyone. He has positional shortcomings, but if he gets the kind of tactical chaos he loves, then he can drag down even the strongest grandmasters. On the other hand, when you decide to live on the edge of a cliff in every game, sometimes you're the one that falls off. White, on the other hand, is Alex Yermolinsky, who is a very famous grandmaster. So, white retreats the bishop to a safe square since the pawn on h6 was threatening to take it. And Tate keeps pushing. Queen a5 check. So his opponent simply pushes the pawn and blocks the check. And now he should have just captured this knight, made a trade. Just take it, and the game would have been interesting. For example, knight c6, and anybody could win. But instead, he just kept piling it on. And so what he did was he played knight f5, hitting the bishop and just trying to get rid of that bishop. And this loses by force. And so Yermolinsky, playing white, accepted black's unintentional invitation. Can you see how white punished his opponent? Here we go. Queen a4, giving your queen away. And the game's over. The problem is that if the queen doesn't stay on this diagonal, you're going to get mated because the king has no legal moves. Notice this bishop controls all these squares, so any check will be mate. Normally one would resign in disgust, but Tate, seeing that there's a big audience, decided to give the fans what they wanted, and so he went into it. Queen takes queen, and he allowed knight to c7, mate. That's brutal. One of my favorite players is black. I love his name, Paul Saladin Lendhart. Ah, I love that name. Nonetheless, e4, e5, and d4. This isn't very good. After takes, the queen's out too early. This is known as the center counter, but almost nobody plays it anymore. The queen gets pushed around. And sure enough, Lendhart hits the queen with his knight. Moves the queen to safety, the other knight comes out. Brings the bishop out, and plays a very interesting move, knight e5, hitting the bishop, but there's some tactical reason for it. So the bishop retreats, thinking, why did he move there? I'm just going to kick the knight away with my pawn. So why would he do this? But of course, black is the far stronger player. So after bishop b3, he plays bishop to b4 check. And once again, white says, what is that about? I can just use the pawn, hit it, and he has to retreat. But this was a massive mistake. Natural move, but a massive mistake. And suddenly, the game just falls right on white's head. Bishop to c5. Suddenly, the queen's attacked. What's happened is, if you go back one move, you'll notice that this pawn on c2 guards the d3 square. So the reason for this check was that if c3, this square is open. The pawn no longer controls it. So after bishop c5, if he were to take it, which he didn't, knight to d3 is a fork. You hit both the king and queen. And so that's what the guy missed. He's not going to fall for it, but he notices it now, but it's a little too late. So what he does is he moves to g3, thinking, okay, I won't fall for your trap, but what I'm going to do is I'm now threatening your knight with check, and I'm threatening your g7 pawn. So maybe I'm doing really well. Maybe I'm really going to win this game. No. And now the hammer of God comes down on the guy's head, bishop f2 check. And white had to resign right away. The problem is, if he played king takes f2, and you have to take the bishop because the bishop in this initial position is hitting both the queen and the king. If he took it this way, now knight takes e4 forks the king and queen. You lose your queen. If he takes it with the queen, you walk back into this earlier fork, which also forks the two pieces. So he lost his queen and he gave up the game. Everyone gets diced and sliced in this way when they start out. And these overwhelming defeats are pure gold if you insist on searching for the cause of the loss. Once you do this, and once you realize just how dangerous no development and no castling can be, you'll move on to a whole different level. We'll finish our study of short games with one of my favorites. It excited me as a child, and I still smile when I see it today. It's longer than our previous games, but any game under 25 moves is considered short. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. d4, f5. This is known as the Dutch defense. Knight f3, and we're just going to head towards the fun part. Normal moves. Nobody seems to be doing anything spectacular, and you think it's just going to be a long, hard game. No. Soon it becomes one of the most famous games in history. Bringing his pieces close, and the only guy castled is black, so you would think it's white that would run a cropper because his king's in the middle. But again, no. And here we go, queen h5. What's happening here is he threatens to take this and uncover this on h7. And we've seen what happens on h7. The queen and the bishop together can wipe that point out. So black sees this. So he plays queen e7, so that if he does take, uncovering these two things, the queen and the bishop on h7, he can actually take back with the pawn, and now the queen would guard it, and everything is fine. So he thought he was safe. All this seemed perfectly reasonable. However, queen takes h7 check, giving the queen away. A fantastic move. This has been magazines all over the world, in books, everywhere. It's just an iconic game. King takes. Knight takes f6, double check. Now you're hitting it with the knight and with the bishop. So he has to come upwards. He can't go back because this is mate, two-knight mate. This knight controls these two, and the knight hits the king. So he avoids that, and now he's just swept away. He really doesn't have any choice in anything. Here we go. All right, knight eg4, check. Move 13. The king has no choice. It starts wandering into enemy territory. Another check. It wanders further. Another check. No choice. Another check. All the way in. Another check. And now white says, you know, I'm supposed to castle as quickly as possible, so I think I will. Castles mate. You don't see anybody castling with mate very often. Speaking of brutal finishes, we'll finish this lecture with a look at the chess position that was supposed to be used in the first Harry Potter movie. I was asked to create that film's key chess showdown, and I went out of my way to give them something that was true to the book, but also had some serious emotional punch. Since black threatens a smothered mate by knight h3 mate, white played queen takes d3, preventing the mate and capturing a pawn. Black now plays rook c3, giving away his rook, but freeing the diagonal of this bishop. White took it. Now he gives away the knight. Now, this knight is Ron. So Ron sacrifices himself for the greater good by dragging the queen away from this c5 square, allowing Harry, which is the bishop, to end the game. He takes the knight, the bishop comes here, and because the queen had been eating everything and actually is something you want to see die, I made it so the queen has to go in front of the bishop. It's the only way to stop mate, and Harry would have killed the queen with checkmate, and everybody would have been happy. This was supposed to be the big emotional moment in the game. But when the editors were unleashed, they cut the whole sequence, only giving knight h3 check and then bishop e3 mate, without even taking white's queen. So in typical movie-making fashion, a very dynamic, emotional chess scene ended up being pure gibberish. But now you know what might have been possible.